just going to introduce our guest speaker for today briefly. Peter Argondizzo attended the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, where he graduated with a major in finance and human resources management. After graduation, he went on to become an Italian translator and a project manager, and he founded Argo Translation in 1995 and has decades of experience in the translation industry. His talk is entitled 23 Years After Curtin Hall, A Journey Through the Translation Industry. Welcome, Peter.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Glad to be back. I haven't been back since 2009. And by the way, I like to make this very conversational, so if there are any questions or anything that you want to discuss, just raise your hand. I'd rather do it that way, because of course I don't know necessarily the things that you want to talk about. I think I know. I covered some of the things, but please just raise your hand. So some of the things that I hope to cover today is just a little bit about our company, a little bit about me, just so you know where my background is. As you know, it really wasn't language. This was sort of an accident. I have a minor in Italian. Now, I grew up in a bilingual household and then studied Italian here, but not until sort of the end of my path here at the university did I realize that language would be sort of the direction I wanted to go in. You have to remember back then, it was a little cloudy in terms of language as being a career. Actually, your options were far more limited. It might be just teaching instead of like translation. And I shouldn't say, I don't mean it by just teaching, but that was your option. You go into languages, you'll teach. That's it. In fact, most of the translation in those days was done by university professors sort of as a side thing, and it wasn't really taken seriously as a career, where now there are so many options. So I hope to go over that a little bit. Why don't we just go ahead and get rolling? And as Victoria mentioned, I did go to school here. I have a degree in finance and human resource management with a minor in Italian. That was great. I had breakfast with my old professor today, Larry Baldassaro, so that was wonderful. It's good to catch up with him. All through college, I worked at an airline. So you can see I have Midwest Express, which no longer exists. And then I was a project manager at Marquette Electronics. So it's interesting, I was going to go into finance, but I was a little bit disillusioned, so I ended up as a project manager at Marquette, managing their Italian projects. So this was a medical device manufacturer on the north side of town here, and that's sort of where the spark happened. I was there a year, and we were buying from some pretty lousy sources. And of course, when you're young and naive, well, I can do that better. So that's what I did, and started Argo Translation. Our office was on Oakland Avenue, and we were here in Milwaukee for some time. And we moved to the Chicago area. Gosh, I guess it's about 12 years ago now, but I still have very close ties here, a lot of customers, and would love to reestablish my ties with the university as well. I'm a Vistage member. It's called Tech Up Here. That's been very good for our business. That's sort of a business CEO roundtable. I'm married and I have a son who's 13 years old, baseball guy, so I just sort of follow him around in the summers. That's pretty much what I do. And by the way, I was under the influence of cold medicine. So if I have any typos in this, please blame NyQuil. So yes. And yes, my son's name is Arrigo, of course. His middle name is Dante, which I can credit to Larry Baldassaro, because I did study Dante while I was here, and really I enjoyed that course. So my son's name is Arrigo Dante. With a name like Argondizzo, Tom just doesn't work. So we went with Arrigo, but he's RA for short. A little bit about our firm. We do a lot of the things that you would expect a translation services firm to do, right? We handle translation, of course. We do websites, brochures, manuals, apps. The progression over 20 years has really been toward the technology. In other words, we're doing a lot more software, a lot more websites. I'm going to continue to drink so I don't have a coughing attack, so I apologize. It's kind of like a Marco Rubio moment, I guess. So anyway, we also do page production, so that's also very big now in terms of, when I first started a long time ago, it was really galley copy. In other words, folks would give us a manual and actually send you the physical manual. I know this is hard for you guys to imagine. And we would just, the translator, because there were no tools, by the way, either, would just retype the translation in essentially a column of text. And there would be a desktop publisher who spoke no languages, who would often rekey or cut and paste the content in. So you can imagine how many errors would get through in that process. I mean, the world has changed so much. I mean, just to give you an idea as well, it's not that long ago, at least that's what I tell myself. It's not that long ago. There was, email didn't exist. I mean, it was really what we'd call like online bulletin board sort of things where you're swapping files. And even that was ridiculous because we had 56K modems. So you can't even understand what that is. So, but now the business has changed completely. Obviously, we're very much dependent on technology to do the things that we do. We also offer telephonic interpretation, and we don't really do on-site interpretation. We found that you really have to specialize in that because you have to have a really good bench of interpreters. So we partner with a firm in Chicago called Interprenet now for all of our on-site interpretation. A little bit of what we've done. We work with over 340 clients, not on a regular basis, but sort of on an ongoing basis. We handle all those different industries. And this floors me. This is like my McDonald's stat, right? Over 100 million words translated across 72 languages. Basically, where we've sort of made our name is in XML and content management systems. So where we specialize is in handling specialized projects with special data needs. So in other words, I used to be a project manager at Marquette Electronics, and after I left, they started this move to a content management system, and at that time, that was very, very new. And where we help them map the data structure so that it could be easily translated, so that translations could happen more quickly, more efficiently, less expensively. We actually eliminated sort of this idea of page production. We were doing XML, and it would go straight to a PDF, so there was no desktop publishing. And at the time, this was very, very cool. And it was interesting to be involved in such a project because we were a very small company competing against SDL, which is a mammoth-sized company. So it was really great that we were able to beat a large company in handling that type of specialized content. If I get one point across today, this is what I hope the main point is for you. Don't let anyone tell you that translation is an unnecessary cost. The way that you need to market yourself and your own services, because this is essentially what you're doing, whether you know it or not, you're all starting your own businesses. Whether that means you're seeking employment in our industry or you decide to start your own business. You are selling an opportunity for revenue growth. That's what you're selling. You are not a cost. You're going to do one of two things. You're going to help people sell some more stuff, some people that are not in their own country, or you're going to help them communicate with employees. It's really one of those two things. Essentially, that's what we do for all of our customers. We have some large multinational companies that we work with, like Caterpillar. All we do for them is internal communications because they have offices all over the world. Without us, right, they don't have that same means to communicate with their employees. I mean, could you imagine the language barriers that are involved with trying to communicate with these employees in all these different countries? And if the message is misconstrued, what the ramifications are? So again, if there's anything that you get out of the presentation, please understand that you are not a cost. You're a revenue driver. Just to help you guys understand, I did a presentation not too long ago with Scott Abel, and I asked him if I could steal these slides because I think they're really good. I'm sure you all know, because you're here and you're spending money on this, education, right, that you are in the right industry. So 96% of the world population lives outside of the US. And given the choice, customers always prefer products that feel local. I mean, you're starting to see this more even with smaller brands. You're seeing that they're going global. Because they realize that if they're only defining themselves as a US company, they're really limiting themselves in terms of their markets. And you've heard, of course, of all the, we always talk about in the translation industry, right, that some of these are a little tired, right, but the whole idea of the Nova, right, when they went to Mexico, Nova doesn't, okay, so you get that. There's all these sort of tired examples of companies going into other countries and failing. So now you'll see that there's this huge emphasis on how do we do it right? How do we go into another market and how do we do it right? So there's this huge push for folks like us to help companies do that properly. And this number is only going to get larger, right? The 11% of our population here are non-native English speakers. So one of our things that we do a lot of, we work with a lot of school districts. So you get newly immigrated families, and you have no way of communicating with the parents and a very limited way of communicating with the students. So that's an example. Gosh, I have one client who has no English-speaking employees. It's and just to show you sort of the scale, right? There's Caterpillar, but then there's Deerfield's Bakery. Their employees all speak Spanish. So we're integral to their communication strategy with their employees. Why is that again? Because we have this large population here that don't speak English. And one thing that I want to add that I think is interesting, politics, just for a quick second, is there's this huge push on, gosh, we have all these people in this country that don't speak English. This is nothing new. So my parents are immigrants from Italy. They came over in the 60s. The only difference is now we help people, but in the 60s it was sort of like, learn English, you dumb person, right? So now it's different, right? Now we help people. Back in the 60s when my folks came here, not so much. That really wasn't the way. And that's sort of on us. Maybe someone in this room will go on to become an ESL instructor. Totally different path, but those people do something that's incredibly valuable in our economy, is helping these people understand our language and learn and prosper in this country. All right, I'm sure most of you know this as well, that Canada essentially is partially a French-speaking country, right? So 40% of their population are non-native English speakers. So basically, almost half of revenue of large corporations comes from outside of the US. And again, just to make you feel better about the money that you're spending. Jobs in our sector are set to grow by 42% through 2020. The average salary in our industry is about $43,000. This comes from Common Sense Advisory, which is sort of the leading gurus of data in our business. Salaries can be much higher than that, and they can be much lower, which we'll talk about a little bit later, depending on what you do. When I say lower, they can be zero low, is what I mean. Just if you're a freelancer, it might be that way for a little while. So, any questions before I go forward? I'd rather it be conversational, so if anyone has any questions, anything, no? Okay, great. So yesterday, actually we talked a little bit about what the industry looked like when I first started. And it's funny because when I first started in the business about 21 years ago, it really wasn't that different than maybe it was 20 years previous to that. But now the leaps that we've made in these 20 years is pretty incredible. Translators are faced today with, I talk to our translators on a regular basis. The problem they have is that there's so many technologies out there, and I understand you're going to likely cover this with Victoria next semester, or if you've already taken the CAT class, you'll even be aware of some of this already, is that there are companies out there that have created their own translation management systems. So they're tired of buying from the large companies like SDL that are also translation service providers, and they just went out and created their own system. Or then there's all these offshoots. There's a bunch of cloud systems. Now there's even a movement to create little mini environments. There's a company out there called CloudWords and another one called SmartLing, that what they basically do is they approach a corporation and say, we're going to give you the technology to manage your own translations. It's going to be within our framework, and we're also going to let you crowdsource your translation projects, which, by the way, I'm not a big fan of. So I'm always a big fan of saying, all right, this is a project I have. How do I match the best person to the job? Crowdsourcing, unfortunately, has this way of giving the project to the lowest bidder, regardless of qualifications, especially if you don't do it with the right parameters around it, sort of like a reverse auction. And personally, I don't want the jobs to go to the low bidder. It usually has different connotation, right, if it goes to the low bidder, especially when you're dealing with very technical stuff. I mean, one of our clients, a client of ours for a few years before they were bought out, they made cranial stents, right? So I don't want that job to go to the low bidder. We also do a lot of work with defibrillators, another job that I don't want to go to the low bidder. But in essence, these are the things that face those of you that are coming into the industry now, or freelancers even that have been in the business for a long time. Their whole world has become reinvented. One of my translators recently said he did a count, and he now works in 10 different translation management systems. And of course he's frustrated because he's, on a daily basis he's jumping between system to system, and the quick keys. And a translator is essentially paid by how many words they can output in a day. And if something as similar as just like cut and paste or lookup or those types of commands in their system change from the different companies they work with, it impacts their productivity, which means a direct hit to what they earn. So these are all things that make the freelancer's life incredibly difficult. So when we've evaluated CAT tools in the past, and with the most recent one, we recently moved to WordBee, we wanted to make sure that there was the ability to customize the quick keys or the shortcut keys, so that then at least the translators that are a little more interested can somehow choose the ones that they're most comfortable with. It's a very tiny little thing, but it's something that's incredibly helpful for a freelance translator, and they appreciate that, by the way. Because of course there's companies like ours that, you suddenly get an email, hey, we just bought a new translation management system, welcome. Well, that's not what they necessarily want to hear. So to draw a contrast, of course, we go from the typewriter to a server room. And this is also very evident in our own business. Again, I mentioned a little bit about how it was when we first started, but now we've taken the technology that we use. We use WordBee, and we've integrated it into our whole business platform. So our project managers are tasked with understanding, how does this system relate to this system to this system? We have about 4 systems that compromise our production environment. And there's a file archival system, there's an accounting system, there's WordBee, and it's all linked together. And these are things that, again, we wouldn't even have talked about years ago. So a little bit about the technology. So now hopefully this is the part that makes it worth your time today. So translation management systems. Obviously you have to learn, everybody know what a translation management system is? Pretty much, yes. Okay, great. So do you have to learn all of them? No. But I would say at least learn 1 or 2 of them very well. I understand that you may be learning about MemoQ soon. That's a very good one. Trados is still sort of the number 1 tool that's out there, STL Trados. Might not be a bad idea to learn that one as well. What you'll find are there's some common functionality across all of them. So I would say, at a minimum, if you can leave the university knowing at least one of them very well, that'll serve you well. That'll be good for you. Content management systems. Whether you know it or not, you probably have had exposure to content management systems. Have any of you ever dabbled in a blog or websites? A little bit. Okay, WordPress. So WordPress is one. Obviously, there's a lot of other ones. Drupal, Joomla, Kentico. We can go on for days. But that's really where the industry is moving. So people are using content management systems not only to handle material on the web, but they're using it to handle their own printed documentation as well. Or help systems. That's also very big. So for us, most of the work we do these days, just to give you an idea, we used to go through about a case of paper a week. Now we probably go through about a case of paper per year. It's unbelievable. We used to do so many printed manuals that we would actually have to do what we call page checks for quality control. Now there's nothing that actually prints. Most of the material that we do goes either straight to PDF, and that's not the most favorable target or output. It's usually for the web or a help system. Because most of us, when we're using something and we struggle, we go to the web and we look for an article, or we hit the question mark within the software, and you get an article. So it's all very article driven. This also is very difficult on the translator, because now you're not seeing something that looks like a book, that has some sort of continuity. Suddenly you're translating some material from, gee, how do I print this report? And now you're talking about, how do I troubleshoot a network connection? There's no continuity. And oftentimes the translator will see this stuff in sort of a jumbled mess because it's coming out of XML. So these are the challenges as a project manager in trying to provide context. Because as translators, we always want to have context. What is the context around these topics that we're translating? So that's sort of where the challenge is going. But you really, and to my next bullet with XML and HTML, if at all possible, you want to know a little bit about either one of those two. And they're very simple concepts, but if you haven't been exposed to them, it seems like you're suddenly studying Greek, right? It's a completely different language. But in translation, you'll find that when you do get to the CAT class and you start to look at translation examples, you'll see all these codes that appear within the content. And you have to understand what they mean. There's nothing more frustrating as a project manager to receive a translation back, and the codes are sort of pushed to the front of the sentence or the back of the sentence. Those codes mean something. It might be something like a hyperlink, or it might be bold or italics or something like that. So just understanding how writers today write material is going to be very important for you, either as a project manager or as a translator. Are there a lot of interpretation students in the room? Okay. Because I should probably spend a little bit of time on that, and I can. Because early on in our days, we did do some interpretation. So I'm going to add a bullet at the end. So, otherwise, yes, I'm very focused on translation. As we are as a business, that's what we've become. But we'll talk a little bit about it. Regular expressions. Anyone familiar with regular expressions? So basically, regular expressions are sort of a way to tell the translation management system how to do something. So in other words, you'll often get files from clients that have material in it that doesn't require translation. Say, well, of course, we want you to keep that in the file, but don't translate it. That's code, or that's this, or that's that, or it's something from another system. So through regular expressions, you can write a pattern. Say, exclude this content or include this content. And that's something that would sort of be like, the sort of the master's degree level sort of material as a project manager. So those that have been with us for a long time are just now starting to write regular expressions. But it's very difficult. But if you get some exposure to that, that would make you incredibly marketable as well. Page production, it seems like we all do layout now, right? In the old days, it was sort of, well, you take it to someone to do, paste up. Now it seems like we all use either InDesign or even Microsoft Word to create a flyer. Well, if you know a little bit about true page production, it's really good because as a project manager or a translator, you're often, whether you like it or not, encumbered with an issue that is caused by page production. To kind of get down to the nitty-gritty a little bit, when people are laying out a manual or a document, they'll just put hard returns in there. Oh, I want a hard return there. Well, that kills translation management software. Because remember, we're sentence-based. And most of us do inverted word order, right? Or sentence order when we translate, depending on the language, of course. But if you're splitting a sentence in half, I've now invalidated the translation management system. You wouldn't know these things unless you had a little bit of exposure to a page production tool. And sometimes you have to open the file from the client because they have no idea what you're talking about. You can explain it to them till you're blue in the face. But they don't understand. What do you mean? Just convert it. That's my favorite, by the way. Just convert it to French, would you? My favorite. So, another Marco Rubio moment. All right. So, you may actually be tasked with opening up the file in InDesign or FrameMaker or whatever tool and getting rid of these hard returns. And you have to, unfortunately, let the client know as well, this is the things that I'm doing. You always want to let things wrap the way they're supposed to wrap. That's actually the idea in most electronic delivery, whether it's web or help. You want to let things wrap the way they're supposed to. But if you get some old school typography folks or desktop publishers, they're putting hard returns in there. They're sometimes laying on the keyboard. The keyboard is not a tool for formatting, by the way. We should learn that all right now. You should never lay on the space bar. That kills translation management system software. So, programming. I mentioned a little bit that we're doing more and more in apps, and we do software localization. And just having an understanding, a little bit of, I'm not saying you need to be a software engineer, but if you have a little bit of an understanding, like one of the things we do a lot of is we will translate software for a client, and then we'll translate the documentation. It has to happen in that order because invariably in the documentation, you refer to the software. And for me, as a user, nothing aggravates me more than when I read something, whether it's in English or whatever language, and they're saying, find the print option, and there is no print option. It's instead print report. Well, is that what you really meant? Well, that's annoying. It's even more annoying in translation. So we'll typically translate the software, but what does that mean? You're looking either at XML or an executable file or Java properties, or just understanding a little bit about software is incredibly important. if you have a little understanding in XML and HTML, which is essentially a language, a lot of the software programs work in a very similar way. There's tags that tell the software to do something, and that's essentially what happens in XML and HTML, very similar in software. But you get all these sort of nitty-gritty little items like character length. Like one of the things we do for our clients is they don't realize, hey, we've got this great product in English and we're going to Germany now. Great. Did you put any extra space in? No. Well, compound nouns, right? So compound nouns will kill you in German because we're looking at an expansion and we're also looking at words that don't break. They can break, but they don't break naturally. You have to do it manually, right? And what we do for clients is we have a tool that we use that will just put in a bunch of characters. So you choose the language, you choose German, so it'll put your umlauts and your different characters in there, but grow it by 40%. And then we give it back to them and say, hey, try to build your software. And it typically doesn't build. They'll have tons and tons of overwrites and errors, and that's where we try to nip that in the bud early on. Because essentially what happens otherwise is now you're tasked with having to abbreviate to the length of the English. And then it may as well be hieroglyphics. So always our advice to clients at that point is if they have no flexibility for that specific release, leave the English. Because again, if you have German that's abbreviated to this when it needs to be this, hieroglyphics. It may as well be in English, and then when you translate it, there's ways to address it. You can leave the English and put a German equivalent in parentheses, so at least the user knows what they're looking at. So these are things that, again, you don't necessarily come across until you have a little bit of experience, because it's very difficult to tell a client, yeah, you shouldn't translate that. Now, especially, isn't that how I make a living, right? So you shouldn't translate that. Well, I've essentially given a project away. But always do the right thing. Do the thing that's going to help your customer, not the thing that's going to help your own wallet, and it will pay off in multiples.
Peter, do you mind, before you leave this slide, I just want to mention to people, I'm not sure that people are aware, a lot of these programs that Peter is talking about, he talks about InDesign, FrameMaker, XML, HTML. UITS at UWM offers short courses in these programs, and they offer deep discounts to students. So look at the UITS website and look at some of these courses that they offer face-to-face. They offer free versions of these training things online too, but the face-to-face can be a really good way to get hands-on and get a little bit of exposure to some of the programs that Peter's talking about. And that doesn't, you lose access to those courses once you graduate. So if you can squeeze it into your semester, I know everyone's very busy, but it's really a worthwhile investment. Sorry.
No, that's great. That's phenomenal. If you have the opportunity, definitely do it. It'll help you, anyway, right, with whatever you're trying to get into. If you absolutely can't do it that way, or you've already graduated, or whatever the case is, there's another resource called lynda.com. It's lynda.com. They teach just about anything there. And they actually have classes on regular expressions, on XML, HTML, some InDesign. Some of it's free, some of it's paid for. But there are some really good resources online as well. All right, use of cloud-based applications. So this is crazy. This is sort of where our world has gone. We're entirely cloud-based. So our accounting system is cloud-based. Our translation management system is called WordBee. That's also out in the cloud. We use Box, not Dropbox, but Box. It's sort of the corporate level version of archival software that we use. It's how we deliver all of our projects to our clients. And then we have all these. We actually have a developer that works part-time for us. He does about 20 hours a week, just developing little widgets between all of our applications and, of course, troubleshooting them because invariably the cloud software gets updated and things break. So we actually have, and that's probably a position that maybe no one ever would have really imagined would be a position at a translation services firm, but as we grow, I would imagine that's only going to become a full-time position. All right, so working in the industry. It's really hard to break into a translation services firm. I can't speak for everyone. I don't know that they're all wired exactly like we are, but we're incredibly loyal. So we have a translation team that we've built over 20 years, and we have some very good linguists. So the ones that because you have to remember our name rests on it, right? So why try something new if I've already got something that works? So that's the challenge you're going to have as a freelancer. So you really need to separate yourself from the crowd. And you're competing. You're essentially competing with folks from Europe, because we have translators that are all over the world. So you're essentially competing in a global marketplace. So you have to do whatever you can to separate yourself from the crowd. I can't tell you how important your email is. Your email should definitely be personalized. You should really work on your resume to show what sort of benefits you can provide a translation services firm. If you've done some of these extra classes, list them. If you've done some InDesign training or you have some background in the web, list it. If you have experience in another industry, don't think you shouldn't list it because it looks like it's not applicable. List it. Most of our successful translators come from other worlds. Just to give you an idea, our lead Chinese linguist is a physician. She's non-practicing. She came over to the States and decided, well, I don't really want to do this. I don't want to do the boards. I've got a child. I don't really want to do this. So that's what she does. She became a full-time translator. Thankfully, we discovered her about 5 years into her career, which is good because all the bugs were worked out at that point. But she's phenomenal and has an incredible understanding of even industries outside of healthcare and medical. One of our lead Italian linguists is an engineer by trade. Came to the U.S., decided he didn't want to go into engineering, became a translator instead. Now, we have plenty of traditional, I don't want to discourage anyone, we have plenty of folks that are from a more traditional background. Our lead French translator came out of the program at Georgetown years ago. I think it might have been one of the first in the country, I think. She's phenomenal. She lives in the Chicago area. So just make sure that you're doing a good job of selling yourself through your resume, through your email, through your cover letter. You want to make sure to do that. Networking. Are any of you involved in at least MATI, perhaps? The local, good, outstanding. So that's great. We are as well. I'm sorry I missed the last meeting in Indiana, but we were a sponsor, but we couldn't attend. And the ATA is also very good. And they try to embrace you folks that are coming up into the business now, right? So they have all sorts of discounts for students. You don't have to pay the regular rate. But I encourage you to read the magazines. Become well-versed on the lingo that works in our industry. There's another one that is really good too. It's called Multilingual Computing. It's a magazine that comes out. It's perfect for insomnia. If you can't sleep, I'm kidding. It's a really good publication, but they cover some really crazy nitty-gritty stuff.
I'm sorry to interrupt you again, but Multilingual offers a free subscription to students. So we'll send out an email link to the information so you can access that. Sorry. Karen.
No, that's great.
What was the title again?
Multilingual Computing.
Thanks.
I was kidding about the insomnia thing. Forget I'm being taped. I'm probably going to be hunted down by the end. But it's very good. I mean, some of the topics that we're talking about, they go over in great detail. I wrote a review a couple years ago for them about Madcap Flare, which was one of the leading providers of help software authoring. They're the leading tool for authoring help systems, and did a review for Multilingual Computing a few years ago. LinkedIn, there's a bunch of translation groups on LinkedIn, and that's all sort of free advice. You're hearing people ask some pretty specific questions. Within the ATA as well, I should mention there's language divisions that you can join, and some of their, I'm going to date myself by calling it listserv, nobody calls it that anymore. Some of their email groups, again, they're discussing some really interesting terminology questions, things that you can learn. One of the things that I didn't talk about a little bit earlier as well is if you do have a passion, so let's say your passion is sports. Did you know there's actually a whole sect of translators that focus on sports-related materials? The Major League Baseball now has a rule that if you're signing a non-English speaker, their contract has to be translated. A friend of mine is a sports attorney, and we recently did, it's about 2 years ago, the Brewers signed someone, I don't recall who it was, but we translated the contract. If your passion instead is, cooking, there's a lot of projects out there that have to do with that industry. One of our clients makes flavors. So it's interesting, you really have to understand food to be able to translate those materials. I'm not sure who has healthcare devices, not sure. But if you have a passion for something, or you have a background in biology, or if this wasn't your first choice and you studied something else, you can transition that into a very successful translation career as well. I'm just curious, how many of you are thinking about becoming freelancers? project managers? Okay, a few more. How about interpreters? Okay, all right, interesting. Did I miss something? Anyone else, like some other occupation that I haven't thought of? No? Okay. You guys aren't very participatory. Is it because it's like 300 degrees in here? Is that what it is? So this is like the opposite of, usually in conference rooms they try to keep it at like 60 degrees to keep everyone, this is like the opposite. Right? We're trying to sauna effect. Just kidding. All right. All right, and once you're ready, you have to have incredibly thick skin. People are going to criticize your work to an extent that you can't even imagine. We recently did a project recently. See, everything's recently to me, but it could be 15 years ago. So we did a project for a client, and it was a manufacturing. It was a CNC device, and it was this very technical brochure. And this guy goes to a trade show, this client, and he's very proud of his new Spanish brochure. And he calls, we did it through an intermediary, he calls the marketing services firm that we were working for. And they said, well, Argo Translation did it, call them, because they didn't want to deal with this, because he was very upset. And he said to me, he gets me on the phone, the project manager says, this guy's really upset, talk to him. And of course, it's sort of a fire drill. Usually we say, all right, what is the markup? What show me the errors? But this was a fire drill. He's at a trade show, and someone just told him the brochure is incomprehensible. So I asked him, well, tell me a little bit about what's going on. I said, I don't know. They just said it's incomprehensible. I said, really? Who was this person? He said, it was one of my clients brought over his son, who is a freshman and studying Spanish, and he can't understand anything in this brochure. So I said, well, listen, do you have kids? Oh, yeah, I have one in 8th grade. I said, good, close enough. Does your 8th grader understand the English of your brochure? Oh, God, no. So why do you think a Spanish student who's just learning how to ask for the bathroom would understand terminology about CNC machinery? But this is really what it is. Remember what I said about converting? Can you convert this to Spanish? People think that this is a very linear occupation, that you can use Google Translate. Oh, gosh, that's great. Don't need you. I've got Google Translate. Or they can take some program and somehow convert something from English into another language. So there's a lot of this where you really have to have thick skin. Now, in the early days when I didn't have such thick skin, I might fly off the handle a little bit, but you understand very quickly that really this is a client education issue. The country is still very ignorant when it comes to language. So, is that new? That's not new anymore. So you really have to work with your clients and help them understand. Once they do understand, they're going to be your advocates. They're going to trust you. But you won't do it by flying off the handle. Instead, what you need to do is go through their issues very programmatically. And if they have, always ask for a markup. Can you show me what you're upset about? Well, it's just bad. That doesn't count. It's the same with peer reviews. If you had someone read one of your papers that you were to submit, someone would need to give you a markup to tell you what's wrong with it. It's bad. Well, that's not helpful. So it's another thing that qualifies whether you have a good client or not, is how participatory are they in the process. This has to be a collaboration. Anytime we haven't had that level of collaboration, it hasn't been a good customer relationship. So you'll want to make sure to develop thick skin. People are going to tell you things that you don't want to hear. And sometimes they might be right. Sometimes not. It's okay. It might be terminology differences. We find that there's terminology differences across companies, even within the same industry. So that's thankfully, this is where the tools come in, right? That's why they have the term base or this idea of glossary building. And you can say, well, this is the glossary for XYZ company. And when you work for this other company, it's different. So there's their glossary. And you can use them you can use them when you're working on the given client. So very important, thick skin. Never stop learning. We have lost some translators over time, sometimes because of some bad choices with translation management systems, but also because there are times when a translator realized that perhaps the world was moving beyond their skills. In our early days, we had some folks, and by the way, this doesn't need to be age dependent, because we have translators that are young and can't figure out the technology, and translators that are older and are whizzes. They can jump from system to system and have no problem. So it isn't age dependent. But there are folks that realize, hey, the translation world has moved beyond me. this level of technology is sort of not what I'm into. And some of them have moved more into literary translation, which still tends to be a little more old school. Tools don't play as well in literary. Still, translation into English, not as often either, because oftentimes you're dealing with hard copy sources than electronic. You have to have something electronic to use a tool, right? If it's not electronic, you can't use a tool. But never stop learning, whether, again, it's about page production tools or XML or software, whatever it is. If you have the chance to learn about something or another domain, do it. We actually just recently realized that we were starting to get very siloed in our information. Like, oh, well, that's the person who's an expert in Articulate. That's an e-learning program. We decided, well, that shouldn't be the way it should. That shouldn't be that way. So our project managers have recently started tech talks. So one Wednesday a month, they pick a topic and they compare notes on a technology, which is really cool because suddenly one person in the office becomes the expert on something and all the projects tend to go to that person. And that's not really right, for that given tool or domain. So you would rather sort of spread the wealth on that. Use this time that you have here at university to make friends, and if you do go out into the freelance world, stay connected, compare notes. Because you have to be careful. This is my next point, this network. You are not an island. It's good to network. However, just know this, that not all freelancers will be your friend. Nor if you go into my business, will all language service providers be your friend. It's still business, and it still can be cutthroat sometimes. I'll tell you where it's tough, is the Spanish language. I don't know if you guys knew this stat, but the number of Spanish linguists in the ATA outnumbers all other languages combined. So they basically own the ATA. The problem with that is, wow, that's a lot of competition. So you have to be careful. Choose your friends wisely, and when you do, find that person, cover for one another when you're on vacation, because otherwise if you just sort of leave people to their own destiny, they might find another linguist while you're on vacation, right? So maybe that's an editor as well. Like I often, when we recruit new translators and I like their work, the first thing I say is, who do you like to pair up with as an editor? Because the thing you don't want, again, the thick skin thing, is there are times when you'll match a translator to an editor, and the editor wants the work, so they'll be extra hard on the review. And you know what? That doesn't help me. It doesn't help me. It doesn't help the translator. If they're just making stylistic changes, that doesn't help me. So if you are going out into the freelance world, make some friends that you can trust. Not everyone, but make some friends that you can trust. Business practices as well. I can't tell you how important it is to follow through. Almost immediate dismissal from working with us is missing deadlines. We've lost some good linguists to just being sort of, hey. We built our whole business on that. So when I first started, translation, again, wasn't quite as serious. And one of the things that you discover is people didn't stick to budgets or they didn't meet deadlines. So by doing those two things, we grew pretty quickly. So that's where I think the business background, I thought, well, all right, I can do this. Well, that was one of the things that we really stood by is if I tell you something's going to cost X, even though it really cost more to do because it was more difficult, we didn't upcharge our clients. And we still don't today. And if we're late, we give discounts, even if they don't ask. So that's something to keep in mind, is that you want to make sure that you have sound business practices. And I'm very thankful that you guys have a course that talks about business practices. It's very important to learn those things. And make sure, basically, be a good human. That's really the rule. How would you like to be treated as a customer? So that's basically the end of my presentation. I was hoping for a little more conversation, but I want to open it up to questions, and that's why I left a little time. I think we have about 25 minutes, is that what it is? So I'm happy to answer questions. Anything likely to spur more stories, Kate?
Yeah. Do you do all of your quality review in-house, or do you also work with other linguists outside?
So the way our workflow works is, anybody familiar with ISO 9001-2008? Yeah. Okay, so we're ISO 9001-2008 registered, and we have been for about 4 years. Essentially what that means is you have to publish, quote unquote, publish your processes, and you have to stick to them. So our core process is translator, editor, and then project manager in terms of a review. Well, that project manager does some review after translation as well. the tool set that we use has some QA functionality built into it. So we're running QA pretty much throughout the process. But we essentially outsource that editor position as well. Because quite frankly, we don't have the time. We did 2,500 projects last year. So we're too small to be measured at our level. But if we were, plus I don't participate in the common sense advisory thing where they ask you all these very invasive questions. But if we were, we would have the highest output per capita in the industry per project manager. And it's all based on all this technology that I talked about. It's because we hammer out all the boring stuff, right? Nobody wants to look at a 32 language project, just to give you an idea, and it has memory matches and fuzzies and all these sort of things. And you have all this data that you have to enter into an accounting system. Well, we discovered very quickly that that's not fun, and why none of us went to college to do data entry into a proposal. So we've essentially automated that. Like, we can build a proposal incredibly quickly, and that's how we're able to do that output. But we're very busy. So, and also, as project managers, again, you're doing a 32 language project. Well, it's great that you speak Spanish or French and you can pay a little bit closer attention, but there's 31 other languages to worry about. So we outsource that editing role. What's great about WordBee, and probably some of the other software that you guys will be using, is you have a way to measure how much change occurred between the translator and the editor. And if you see that number continually on sort of a high level, you have to ask yourself, is the translator doing their job? The good news is translators aren't shy. Typically. You think they might be, you think, oh, introverted. No, because you're talking about their revenue, right? So if a good editor is saying to themselves, all right, I can do about 8,000 words a day on a clean edit, and now it suddenly becomes 3,000 words, and remember, it's a fixed price, they're going to be the first one on the phone to say, this translation is miserable. And that's why you want objective people as well. Because you really, when they say that, you want to understand that they really mean it. And when they do, then you make your decision. Are we going to move on from using this translator? What does this mean? Is this subject matter not appropriate for them? Are they out of their element? So we essentially outsource that editor part, but there is QA that happens all along the way from the project management team. And that's after translation, after editing, after layout. Does that help? Okay.
So basically what you're saying is that Argo does mostly business to business.
All business to business.
All business to
yeah,
business.
We used to do a fair amount of business to consumer, but it was never a large percentage of our business, but we refer that away now. It's all business to business.
Okay, that's the first thing. And the other thing was, are you a mix of in-house and freelancers or
No.
contracted? Are you all in-house?
We have no translators.
Okay, so you're not in-house at all?
Not at all.
Okay.
And I decided that early on. As we started to grow, I started to think, well, gee, we do a lot of Spanish. Should I get a Spanish language? Here's the problem with that approach. And I love selling against this, by the way, because a lot of the larger agencies will say, hey, we have in-house people. And my response to that is, to the client, is always, wonderful, you have a generalist doing your translation. That's perfect. Because really, essentially, you think of this, if I'm employing a translator full-time and they're not doing anything, from a business perspective, you're going to scoop as much work towards them as possible because you're paying for them regardless. But that doesn't suit the customer very well, because from one minute we might be working on that cranial stent we talked about, or a defibrillator, or then it might be a patent. It's a completely different legal. Completely different domains, and I don't want the same translator on that job. So it gives us maximum flexibility to use freelancers for all of our projects. And essentially that's what the big guys do as well, but it sounds really good to say, hey, we have in-house translators, when essentially they outsource to the same pool that we outsource to as well.
So who is in-house with you? Is it the project managers then, or?
I have 4 project managers. I have an accounting person. There's myself. Then we have a salesperson, a marketing person, and I have 3 additional part-time marketing people. So we're 8 employees total. Yes?
So just along that question, with your project managers, how do you, what's your structure like? I mean, is their workload divided up geographically? Are you global? Or, does one project manager handle a certain region? Or, how does that work?
No, we're very decentralized in that way. essentially when new project managers come in, we tend to give them a book of business that's really good for learning all of our systems. And then as they progress, we give them more challenging projects. But that's a pretty short learning curve. I have one of my project managers is new. He started last December, and he's already doing pretty advanced stuff. So, but it's really, and then what we do is we work with our team to set goals in terms of what they're managing, and then we measure against that. We have all sorts of bonuses that are attached to that sort of thing, but it's really not divided by domain. A little bit by program, and I'm trying to defeat that by doing those tech talks. But yeah, no, we and they pretty much, our project managers are very self-sufficient. I mean, they can do $100,000 quotes without anyone's approval. So that's another thing that I think, and I don't mean this to be a commercial, but that's another thing that separates us, I think, from others. Like what you'll find is if you look at the larger firms, this is phenomenal because this is what I would want to do all day. They have like folks that just do quotes. My favorite is in Trados, they have this tag validation. They have people that just do that all day. Validate tags. No, I'm just kidding. That's not funny, actually. But that's horrible. To do that for 8 hours a day, that you go to school to do what you're trying to become professionals. I get that you need to learn that. But to me, if you don't know the whole process, how helpful is it to just learn how to you can learn how to validate tags in a half an hour with your professors. So to be able to do that 8 hours a day, I think that's not helpful. So our project managers do everything. They actually do their own quotes. They build their own quotes. If it's approved, they get rolling. They pick their own vendors. I mean, we have vendors that we use and who our favorites are, and they sort of collaborate on, who's in and who's out, that sort of thing. But they manage the process from A to Z.
Wonderful. And just to follow up with that, what kind of background do you usually look for when hiring project managers in terms of education, some sort of accreditation? I mean, do they have to be involved with the Project Management Institute, or I mean, what are the kind of things you look for?
We were involved with PMI pretty early on, but it's kind of not in our world, is what I'll say. The PMI tends to be a little bit more towards project managers and other domains. I mean, what we do is pretty specific.
Sure.
So what we look for is, I think my lucky stars for this program. We have one that came out of the program at the University of Illinois, which is pretty new. But thankfully, it has 3-to-1 ratio. We're very heavily stilted towards UW-Milwaukee. So, but I'm very thankful for programs like this one that help you guys get at least a base understanding of what we're doing. So then sort of some of the basic stuff is not something we have to spend time on.
I'm sorry, just to stop you. I don't know what you mean when you say this program. I'm not a student.
Oh, okay.
So I'm a recent graduate.
Okay.
My bachelor's is in international studies, but I just came to get information about translation. So
Oh, great.
I'm a little bit of a novice. So
Well, would you like me to sell you a master's degree?
Sell up.
We'll talk.
Okay.
We have a master's degree program here at UWM. It's a 2-year program online to train translators and interpreters.
Oh, okay.
And
well,
we,
thank you.
yeah,
I didn't
so
know
no,
that.
I would love to tell you more about the program.
Sure, okay.
And one of the things, but that's part of the program as well, is a graduate 3-credit course in project management for translation. So we really kind of drill down into some of the, the PMI principles that you might be familiar with, and how does that actually play out in translation.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Sure. Any other questions? Don't be bashful. Yes.
Do you do work with interpreting?
Thank you for bringing us. See, I promise I didn't go back. See, I didn't follow up. Thank you for holding me true to that. We used to do a lot of interpretation. Interpretation is a very difficult business because essentially you're really managing people's schedules, and interpretation tends to be driven by the legal world, and things get canceled and get moved. And what we realized is that it was difficult for us to maintain, because you have to have steady work. In other words, when I call a translator, we don't even ask them, can you do this project? We just send it to them, and we assume they're going to do it. Well, we didn't have that kind of ability in interpretation because we weren't doing enough of it. So we realized that about a decade ago. And we started outsourcing for a little while to another graduate of this program, Saul, who started SWITS.
I'm doing my internship there right
Oh, great. Okay. So we used to work with Saul, but then because we changed geography, our firm was in Milwaukee for years, but then when we moved to Chicago, we started partnering with a firm called Interprenet. So we basically outsource, we direct refer our interpretation away, other than the telephonic interpretation, which is something that we white label with a larger firm. So in other words, we provide telephonic interpretation, but we're not really driving that business. We're essentially reselling a larger national player. But that's also another cool career, because telephonic interpretation is typically done out of your home. You essentially get set up with some equipment, and you're put on call for a certain amount of time. You're paid a little bit per diem, of your, hey, I'm on call but not getting any work, which you can do some translation work, you can do other things, but then you're doing telephonic interpretation. That's dominated by the healthcare industry. Most of the larger pharmacies and hospitals all subscribe to these services, and you're typically helping folks with language needs around doctor visits and healthcare. Yes, sir.
Do you have to work with pharmaceutical manufacturers?
A little bit. So we're fortunate where we are that there's sort of this row of pharma companies on I-94.
Yeah.
I'm right near Astellas on the Willow Road exit, if you know where that is on 94. So we're like a mile down the road. So Astellas is a client of ours. We do some very interesting work for them. We've done a little bit of work for Abbott, a little bit for Takeda. But that's a very specific, we have a specific group of translators that do that work. It's very, very specific. Like we have a couple biologists, because that stuff is very heavy lifting in terms of the terminology level of work. But it's interesting work. That's a whole, and it's been growing for a long time, area of translation. Astellas is a Japanese company, so it's interesting. We're doing a lot of Japanese into English, as they were trying to do studies that they did in Japan but then wanted to bring to this country. So we do that. And then we also work with these companies called IRBs. And IRBs are the companies that help pharmaceutical companies do their testing. So essentially we're translating all these informed consent forms that say, hey, we're going to try some stuff out on you. How do you feel about that? So basically we translate those forms. So. Good question.
I think I'd like to ask a question on behalf of the class that I'm teaching this semester is online. And it's a class in how to start up a freelance translation business, so a lot about entrepreneurship. And we're talking this week about marketing plans and trying to think about how, as a newcomer to the profession, you might start to make inroads and build relationships and get an agency like yours to sort of give you your first big shot. And one of the things that I heard you say is that, some of the clients that you're working with and with the talent pool that you've developed over the last 2 decades, you've got people that are really reliable. So what's something that you would look for in some, in a new profile of a newcomer to the profession that you would think, I think this person is someone I'd like to offer a job to, or what could they do to sort of convince you as a project manager that they're ready?
So I love to see, it's great that you guys have that class, and I'm also happy to hear that you guys are doing some projects. I think that's great. So I like to see some material along those lines in their resume, some experience, even if it is just sort of, something that was done in sort of a controlled environment, that's okay. I think a little bit of experience in other industries is really good, or, even if it's like the job that got you through college or whatever the case is, it's something different. It gives you some business background. That's really good. Basically just sort of a continual arc too in terms of, employment. And these are things they look for more as an employer as well, is that, long periods of being idle aren't great, so try to fill those in on your resume. I'm always impressed with when people know a little bit about the company. I mean, this is like sort of standard stuff, a little bit about our company, and you maybe did a little bit of research about what we do. Most companies, when you're trying to break into them, will put some information on their site about the firm, about the team, and internship. Offering to do an internship, I think, is really good as well. For freelancers, it's tougher. I think it's probably easier to become a project manager in our world than a freelancer. The freelancer thing, you have to stay on people, and like what I tend to do when freelancers approach us, and like I actually don't mind getting calls. It's funny, freelancers don't typically call. Instead, I get calls from LSPs in Europe that are trying to partner with us. But I'm okay with a phone call, and I usually try to set a time where I talk to someone for about 20, 30 minutes. Here are the things you should try. Here's some of the agencies you should try to break into. Usually the advice that I give, and even offer to do some shadow translation. Say, I'd be happy to sign your NDA, and I really want to get into X. I know your company does a lot of pharmaceutical, or does a lot of pharmaceutical might be tough because of the NDAs around there. But if it's something for like public use, like we do a lot of, like one of my favorite clients does this little thing. It's like a gun-looking thing that when your Christmas lights go out, you put the gun in the socket, and you can go get that Spanish by going to Target, right? So that's okay. That's out there for public consumption. So that's the kind of project I'm happy to say, hey, you can shadow translate on that project, or if it's an instruction manual for something that's readily available. Like we've even done, like that's what I did with Craig. We were talking about Craig earlier. He came in and he ghost translated a bunch of projects, and it was great. And then we give him the original, and he decided, hey, I was pretty close on this one, or I really felt like my tone was in a good place to where the professional was. So I think those are all things that'll help.
Thank you.
Sure. Any other questions? Please.
What do you do for liability?
So it's interesting. Liability in our business is tough. We have some liability insurance, but it's tough because I work with subcontractors. So I can cover the liability of my employees, but it's difficult to push that out to subcontractors. We do have some liability insurance, and the ATA actually has a wholesaler. I forget who it was, maybe Mutual of Omaha or something.
It's Hayes.
Or Hayes now, okay. Where they'll sell you liability insurance. These days it's not that tough to become a corporation. And we did that as soon as we got the client that made defibrillators.
Oh, there you go.
Like, oh yeah.
Life and death. Life and death. Oh yeah.
Yeah. So, we actually go a step further. For myself, because the stakes are even larger. I actually developed a trust, and all my personal assets are in trust because I was truly worried about that. So I got some good legal advice early on. But if you at least have that corporate shield where you form a corporation, there's that little bit of a thin shield, and you'll want to make sure to act like a corporation in terms of having business cards and having the corporate name there. And your attorney would advise you on that, but you can get liability insurance through the ATA. Anything else? Crickets.
With regards to, back to the pharmacy question, do you ever do dispensing guides? Work on that? Not just the studies, but when it comes to
Distributing.
Yeah, you have like 3 inches of paperwork folded nicely on top
I
of the
know.
bottle.
Isn't that something? So we have a client that does. So we've done a fair amount of that. What we haven't done a fair amount of is the stuff that's like at a Walgreens, for example, and they're sort of because there's a content management system, by the way, that's behind that system.
Right.
And what's interesting is I wrote a blog post on this about 3 years ago, maybe. There was a case where there was a mistranslation in an iron supplement, something that's pretty innocuous, unless you take 6 times the amount that you're supposed to take, which is what was stated in the instructions that were given to the Spanish speaker, and almost killed herself with 6 times the amount of iron that she was supposed to have for her illness. And that was being, again, why we would think this with drugs, right? Someone thought in their infinite wisdom that, hey, let's put a machine translation engine behind this thing. And that's essentially what they were doing. And I get that. It's sort of instant delivery, but there's intelligent ways of doing that. And I don't remember the pharmacy that did it, but that was a less than intelligent way of delivering materials to a client. We do, one of our clients created the first instant read HIV testing. It's a swab, and they have sort of one of those leaflets that's huge like that. But the work to go in to do that is very difficult, and the level of review that we have on a project like that, and geez, to change that documentation, by the way, even on their side, has to go through a lot of hoops because there's risk. So the idea of delivering dispensing information to someone on the fly through a machine translation system is incredible to me. I think you'd be far better off providing like interpretation or something. Gee, do you understand this? If you don't, let's get the interpreter on the line. I think it's part of the reason why today you get that question, do you need to speak to the pharmacist? Do you understand the instructions? And if they don't, most of the larger pharmacies have a two-handed phone that they pull out from underneath the counter, and they call Pacific or Language Line, and they get an interpreter on the line, and they explain how to take the drug properly.
So in your quality control, you do the project managers, the last stop. Do you have it in the contracts that you have that then the client will take it from there, and then they put it through if they have their own legal departments and they look it over? Because I know where I used to work at GE, they used to not let anything out the door that their legal department hadn't completely checked through, in addition to whatever else was done for quality.
Yeah, I think that was the case in ultrasound. We were dealing with some of the other divisions. And what they had is it had to have internal review. But internal review, I'll tell you, like if the question was, gee, what is the most difficult part of your job? It would be internal review. And because we get the gamut, right? So we get that kid at the trade show booth. Because seriously, Spanish, I feel sorry for Spanish speakers. Because unfortunately, especially in this country, people determine that having 3 years of high school Spanish makes you a Spanish speaker. And I mean, you will get very educated people who say, you know, I had someone review your document. Really? Oh, okay, great. And you start to look at, wow, they're entering typos. They're entering, what is this? Because essentially, listen, if you worked for a corporation and someone said, hey, you speak Spanish, can you have a look at this? Well, what's your first intuition? Wow, my boss wants me to take a look at this. Red ink, here it goes. I'm going to impress my boss.
Oops.
That's essentially the first gut reaction. So really for me, like client review is the biggest part of our process, where we actually even have a page that's built in our estimates that talks about client review and what is a proper client review. What are the proper qualifications for a client review? At a minimum, they should have the same qualifications you have as a translator.
Right.
If they don't, but essentially, you know who most client reviewers are? A salesperson who allots about 10 minutes of their day to translation.
Well, the legal departments had the same thing too, because they weren't always well versed in the technology or the discipline, and so they're the last ones to look. But they knew the laws, but they weren't going to let it out the door if it hadn't been checked. Because at least, and then that was nice because we could pass the liability onto them.
The issue becomes with client review, and it's a tough one because it's a multi-layered problem. And the problem sometimes starts with, did anyone talk to the foreign offices and say, hey, we're going to get this translated? And their first intuition is, what, you're going to do Italian translation in the US? What they don't realize is we're using native speakers. The company just happens to be here, but my translator might even be in Italy, right? So there's sort of that hurdle. Then the hurdle becomes, did they sign off on the project in English? Sometimes they don't like that content.
Exactly.
Most of our client reviews become criticisms of the English. So what happens is, again, that thick skin, let's go back to thick skin, because now a translator looks at this and goes, these are great markups, but boy, it doesn't look anything like the English any longer. Well, what have we done? We've invalidated the translation management system, right? So the database is useless at this point, because now you don't have, this is English, but this is Italian that doesn't even come close to matching the English. It's useless. At that point is when we have to have a really hard discussion with a client to say, listen, your reviewer is changing your English. Do you want that to happen? Often the answer is no, and now we've just stepped right into a political battle.
Yeah.
So, wow, I thought I was a translator. I didn't realize I was a negotiator. But this is where it comes in right now.
Educator, too.
Yes.
Yes.
So now you have, I'm going through that right now with a large website that we did. This client reviewer is very unhappy. And we finally got him to admit, well, the translation's great, but that's not what I wanted to say.
Oops.
Well, again, that's outside of our domain. It's outside of our control. So it becomes an education process. We really have to work with the client and say, what's the end goal here? Do we have to retrench and create new English? Because that's really essentially, or do we just roll with the punches? The memory's useless. We don't book the memory. We just help you get a release going that's free of typos. Because that's also the thing. You have to understand that not all countries how do I say this the right way?
Mhm.
When we release things, typically here, if we're releasing something, it's a writer that's doing it, it's someone who has qualifications, it goes under peer review. Whereas in other countries, again, it may not be a writer, it's a salesperson. I'm not saying nothing against salespeople. But this happens in a lot of the cultures we work in. They put changes in, and it's full of typos and grammatical errors, and our translators are like, what? They can't possibly do this. So then we're in the role of fixing their changes that don't look anything like the English. So it's a very, very tough spot to be in, and we find ourselves there a lot. And as this world gets smaller, and because it was great 20 years ago, because people are like, I don't know, I don't read Italian. Yes, approved, I have no idea. But now as the world gets smaller and there's offices in all these countries, you're getting input. And sometimes the input isn't, remember I was talking about that collaborative state? That input, we're far outside of the collaborative state. It's become something completely different.
So then what percentage of time do you think that you're spending, and is that is it trending up for client education and customer support, and it's trending up? Because you might, some businesses might eventually need a customer support group that deals with those things on an ongoing basis like that.
So when I first started, just to give you an idea, McDonald's had a translations department that was probably a gentleman named Robert DeFalkenberg, who was a manager, a great guy. I think they had like 25 people on their translation department. And now I think there's one or two. So what you're dealing with is translation has sort of become incredibly important, but yet nobody wants to own it. So it bounces from engineering to corporate to who wants it? It's sort of a hot potato in the corporate world. So what you're dealing with is instead you're dealing with not someone who comes from a translation background and understands what you're trying to say, to more someone who has 90% other duties and 10% of their duty is translation, and they may not even speak another language, so they're not sure what you're talking about in terms of inverted word order. So it's very difficult. So I would say client education is definitely on the uptrend and has been for about 5 or 6 years. And I don't see it slowing down, again, because you have smaller and smaller companies requesting translation. They don't have the resources, the old translation departments. I was in a translation department at Marquette, electronics. There was 7 of us, and now there's none.
Well, I just wanted to thank Peter. Everyone, if you could join me in thanking Peter for coming.
Thank you.